My father died on a Tuesday in the middle of October, and the first thing I felt when the hospital called wasn't grief. It was a kind of administrative dread. I knew there would be paperwork. I knew there would be a house to empty. I knew there would be a long drive back to a place I had spent most of my adult life trying not to think about. My name is Adam Reiner. I work as a freight dispatcher outside Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm 34 years old. I have a small apartment, a used truck with one bad headlight, and a job that mostly consists of staring at a screen and telling drivers where to go. I don't have a wife. I don't have kids. My mother died when I was 19, and after that, my father and I spoke maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Birthdays, Christmas, the occasional Sunday when one of us got bored or lonely enough to pick up the phone. We were not close. We were not estranged either. We were something in between, which I think is more common than people admit. He was a quiet man, an electrician most of his working life. He liked baseball on the radio more than baseball on television. He drank 1 beer in the evening, never 2. He never raised his voice at me, not once, in 34 years. When I was a child, I thought that was love. As I got older, I started to wonder if it was something else. Discipline, maybe, or the kind of stillness a person learns when they are trying very hard not to be noticed. The hospital said it was his heart. They said it was quick. They said he had been in the kitchen, that a neighbor heard the sound of him falling and called for help. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. The woman on the phone had a careful voice, the kind they train people to use for these calls. She said the body would be held until I could come in. She said there were forms. I told her I'd be there in the morning. Then I sat on the edge of my bed, in my underwear, and listened to the radiator click and didn't cry. I didn't feel anything I could name. I felt like a man who had been told the weather was changing. I drove back the next day. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way they always do. The porch railing had been repainted recently, sometime in the last year. I noticed that and felt something close to anger, though I couldn't say why. Maybe because it meant he had still been trying. Maybe because it meant there had been a life happening here that I hadn't been part of. The locks were the same. I let myself in with the key he had given me when I moved out at 18. The smell hit me first. Not bad, just specific. Coffee grounds, old wood, a faint trace of the menthol rub he used on his shoulders. The smell of a person who has lived in one place for 40 years and absorbed into the walls. I stood in the entryway for a long time before I moved. Then I started the work. The funeral home wanted certain things. A suit, a photograph for the program, his reading glasses, if I wanted him buried in them. I went room by room. In the bedroom, I found his closet still arranged the way my mother had arranged it before she died. Shirts on the left, pants on the right, ties on a small wooden rack she had bought him at a craft fair when I was maybe 8 years old. He had not moved a single one. I pulled out the dark blue suit he had worn to her funeral and laid it across the bed. I sat down next to it and ran my hand along the lapel. The fabric was thin at the elbows. He had worn it more than I realized. To whose funerals, I wondered? Whose weddings? Whose church services? I didn't know my father's social life. I had assumed for years that he didn't have one. The first 2 days were like that. Sorting, folding, throwing away. I filled garbage bags with expired medications and old newspapers and the kind of small, useless objects a person accumulates over a lifetime. A drawer of dead batteries, a coffee can full of nails, 3 flashlights, none of which worked. I made small piles for the church and the thrift store and the dump. I ate dinner at a diner 2 blocks away because I couldn't bring myself to cook in his kitchen. The waitress recognized me from when I was a teenager. She said she was sorry about my dad. She said he came in every Sunday morning and ordered the same thing. 2 eggs, scrambled, dry toast, black coffee. I had not known that. I thanked her and ate my food and went back to the house and slept on the couch because I couldn't bring myself to sleep in his bed. On the 3rd day, I started on the basement. My father had a workbench down there, in the corner under the stairs. It was the place he went on weekends when he wasn't doing yard work or watching the game. When I was a kid, I used to follow him down sometime. He would let me hand him tools while he fixed lamps or rewired old appliances people had brought him from the neighborhood. He never charged anyone. He said it was a hobby. He said it kept his hands busy. The workbench was exactly the way I remembered it. A pegboard above it with every tool outlined in black marker so he could see at a glance if anything was missing. A small radio on the shelf, tuned to the AM station that did the local news. A coffee mug with a dried ring at the bottom. I touched the mug and felt my throat tighten for the first time since the phone call. I sat down on his stool and put my hands flat on the wood and let it pass. The cabinet was on the wall to the left of the workbench. I had never paid much attention to it as a child because it was always locked. He kept solvents in there, he said. Chemicals. Things a kid shouldn't touch. The lock was small, the kind you'd find on a high school locker. I didn't have the key. I went upstairs and looked through the drawer in the kitchen where he kept keys. The same drawer he had kept keys in my entire life, and there were maybe 20 in there, on rings and loose. I brought a handful down and started trying them. The fourth one worked. Inside the cabinet were not solvents. There were no chemicals. There was a stack of paperback books on the bottom shelf, mostly thrillers from the 80s. There was a manila envelope with what looked like old tax returns. There was a small wooden box that I would open later, and on the top shelf, by itself, was a single VHS tape. The case was generic, black plastic, the kind you could buy in packs of 10 at the grocery store 30 years ago. There was a white label on the spine, and on the label, in my father's handwriting, was a single date, March 14th, 1991, my birthday. I stood there with the cabinet open for a long time. The basement was cold. I could hear the furnace cycle on somewhere above me, and the radiator near the laundry sink began to tick. I took the tape out and held it in both hands. The plastic was cool. The label had yellowed a little at the edges, but the ink was still dark. It was his handwriting. There was no question about that. The slight backward slant on the 4, the way he made his ones with no serif at the bottom. I tried to think of a reason a man would keep a tape with his son's birthday on it, locked in a cabinet in his basement for 33 years. I tried to think of an innocent reason. Home video, maybe. A recording of the day I was born, kept private because it was precious. That made sense. That made the most sense. I held on to that explanation as I carried the tape upstairs. The VCR was still hooked up to the television in the living room, the same television he had bought sometime in the early 2000s when our old tube set finally died. He had never upgraded. He had cable, basic cable, and a small DVD player and the VCR. The VCR had a layer of dust on top of it. I wiped it off with my sleeve and pushed the tape in. The machine made the sound I remembered from childhood, that whirring intake, and the screen flickered to a blue field, and then to static, and then the image came up. It was not me being born. It was a hospital room, but it wasn't a delivery room. It was a regular hospital room. The kind with one bed and a window and a chair pulled up next to the bed. The camera was handheld, slightly unsteady. The angle was low, like whoever was holding it was sitting down. The bed was in the center of the frame. On the bed was a woman I had never seen before in my life. She looked young, maybe my mother's age at the time, maybe a little younger. She had dark hair pulled back from her face. She was holding a baby. The baby was wrapped in a hospital blanket, white with thin blue and pink stripes. She was looking down at the baby and crying, but quietly, the way people cry when they're trying not to make a scene. The camera held on her for a long time. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. Whoever was filming didn't speak either. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, very close to the microphone. After about a minute, the woman lifted her head. She looked directly at the camera. Her eyes were red. She didn't say anything. She just looked. The image held there. Then the tape cut. The next shot was a different room, brighter. A kitchen, I thought. Though it wasn't a kitchen I recognized. The camera was set on a counter, fixed in place. My father walked into the frame. He looked impossibly young. I had to lean forward and adjust my eyes because I had never seen him at that age. He must have been 26 or 27. He was holding the same baby. The blanket was the same. He was not crying. His face was set in a way I knew very well, the way it set when he was concentrating on a difficult repair. He looked at the baby for a long time. He adjusted the blanket. He brushed a thumb across the baby's forehead. Then he turned slightly and said something to someone off camera. and the tape cut again. The third clip was the longest. It was outdoors. A driveway, gravel, a car I didn't recognize, a brown sedan, my father loading a small bag into the back seat, the same woman from the hospital room standing on the porch behind him, watching. She was not holding the baby anymore. The baby was in a car seat, already strapped into the back of the sedan. The camera was filming from somewhere across the driveway, maybe from a second car, maybe from a person standing at a distance. The audio was thin. I could hear wind. I could hear the woman saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. My father closed the back door of the sedan. He walked around to the driver's side. He paused before he got in. He looked back at the woman on the porch. She nodded once. He got in the car. He started the engine. He drove away. The camera held on the porch. The woman stood there for a long time. Then she turned around and went inside the house, and the tape went to static. I sat on the couch for the better part of an hour after it ended. I tried, at first, to find an explanation that didn't change anything. The woman could have been a friend of the family. The baby could have been hers, and my father could have been helping her transport her child somewhere. It was the same date as my birthday, but maybe that was a coincidence. Coincidences happen. Maybe my father had labeled the tape with the wrong date. Maybe the label was unrelated to the contents. Maybe he had used an old tape and forgotten what was on it. There were 100 maybes. I sat with them. I let each one come and go. None of them held. The baby in the tape was clearly a newborn. The blanket was the kind a hospital gives you. The date on the label was specific to the day, and my father, in the third clip, was driving away with the baby in the car, not with the woman, with the baby, by himself. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink and drank it without tasting it. Outside the window, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. The sun was low. I had not eaten since breakfast. I went back to the basement. I pulled everything out of the cabinet this time. The paperbacks, the envelope of tax returns, which turned out not to be tax returns at all, but a stack of pay stubs from the 70s, kept for some reason I couldn't fathom. The wooden box, which I opened on the workbench under the light. Inside the wooden box were 3 things. A wedding band, smaller than the one my mother had worn, which I recognized because hers was in my pocket at that moment, on a chain I had taken from her jewelry box the day before. A small photograph of the same woman from the tape, this time standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, smiling, maybe 20 years old, and a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases, that had been folded and unfolded many times. The paper was a letter. It was not addressed to anyone. It was undated. It was written in a woman's handwriting, careful and small, on lined notebook paper. It said, "Walter, I know we agreed not to write. I know what we said, but I need you to know that I think about him every day. I don't ask anything. I don't want anything. I just need you to know. He has my mother's hands. I saw it in the picture you sent. I am not going to send this letter. I'm writing it because the doctor said it would help. I hope it does. I hope he is happy. I hope you are a good father to him. I think you will be. You are a better person than I am." That is one of the things I knew when I made the decision. Please don't write back. Please don't call. I will not survive it if you do. M. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it and put it back in the wooden box and closed the lid. I did not cry. I want to say that I cried, because that's what I think a person should do in that moment, but I didn't. I felt very calm. I felt the way I imagine surgeons feel when they're about to begin an operation. I felt that something important was happening, and that I would need to be careful and precise about how I responded to it. I went upstairs. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing over the counter. I drank another glass of water. I went back to the living room and rewound the tape and watched it again from the beginning. I paused it on the woman's face in the hospital room. I held the pause until the screen began to shake from the strain on the VCR. Her eyes were brown. Her hair was dark, a little curly at the temples. There was nothing of my mother in her face because my mother had been blonde and blue-eyed and tall. There was, I thought, something of me, the shape of the mouth, the slight asymmetry of the eyebrows. I had always assumed I had gotten those things from some distant relative on my father's side. He had cousins I had never met. There were photographs and albums I had not looked at since childhood. I had never thought to question it. There was no reason to question it. I turned the tape off. I want to be honest about something. In the moment, my first feeling was not grief or shock or even confusion. It was embarrassment. I felt embarrassed. I felt embarrassed that I had not known. I felt embarrassed that my entire life had been built on a piece of information I had been wrong about. I felt embarrassed that there were people somewhere in the world, possibly still alive, who knew this thing about me that I had only just learned. I sat on the couch in my dead father's living room, and I felt small. I felt very small. I slept that night in the guest room, which had been my room when I was a child. The bed was the same bed. The mattress was older than I was. I lay on my back with my hands on my chest and stared at the ceiling and waited for sleep that did not come for a long time. I thought about my mother, who had raised me, who had taken me to the dentist and packed my lunches and yelled at me about my homework and held my hand at her own mother's funeral. I thought about whether she had known. I thought about whether everyone in the family had known except for me. I thought about my grandmother, who had died when I was 12, and the way she would sometimes look at me with a particular expression I had never been able to identify. I thought about my Aunt Linda, my father's sister, who had moved to Florida when I was 6, and whom I had seen only twice since. I thought about her phone number, which I knew was somewhere in my father's things, in the small address book he kept by the phone in the kitchen. I did not call her that night. I told myself I would call her in the morning. In the morning, I didn't. I spent the next 2 days going through every other thing in the house. I told myself I was looking for context. I told myself I was just being thorough, but I was looking for her. I was looking for the woman in the tape. I went through every photo album on the shelf in the hallway. I went through every drawer in the dresser in his bedroom. I went through the boxes in the attic, which had not been opened in 20 years and which smelled of cedar and old paper. I found a lot of things. I found my mother's high school yearbook with little notes from her friends written on the inside cover. I found my father's discharge papers from the army. I found a baby book my mother had kept for me, with my weight and length and the date of my first tooth written in her careful handwriting. I read it cover to cover. There was no mention of the woman. There was no mention of adoption or surrogacy or any irregularity. According to the book, I had been born on March 14th, 1991. At 7:42 in the morning, at the same hospital where the tape had been recorded. According to the book, my mother had held me first. According to the book, I had weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. The book was either entirely fabricated, or my mother had been told the same story I had been told. I found one more thing in the attic. It was a small cardboard box, taped shut, in the corner under the eaves. The tape was old and brittle. I pulled it off easily. Inside the box were letters, maybe 40 of them, all of them in the same handwriting as the letter from the basement, all of them addressed to my father, at this address in this town. The earliest postmark was from May of 1991, 2 months after I was born. The latest was from November of 2018, 6 years before he died. I sat on the attic floor under the bare bulb and read them in order. I will not describe every letter. There were too many, and most of them were short, and most of them said variations of the same things. But there was a story in them. There was a life. The woman's name was Marion. She had been 22 when I was born. She had not been married to my father. The letters did not explain how they had met, but they made clear that they had not been together for long, and that she had not wanted to be a mother. She wrote in one of the earlier letters that she had considered other options and had chosen the one she could live with. She wrote that she trusted my father. She wrote that she trusted my mother, who in the letters was called Susan, who in real life had been called Susan, and who according to the letters had agreed to the arrangement before I was born. My mother had wanted a child and had not been able to have one. The letters made this clear. They referred to it as the agreement. They referred to it as the gift. Marion wrote about her own life. She had moved out west not long after I was born. She had married eventually. She had 2 other children, a girl and a boy, both younger than me. She sent occasional photographs, which my father had kept in a separate envelope at the bottom of the box. I looked at them. The girl was maybe 10 in one of the pictures. She had dark hair and a serious face. The boy was younger, blonde, smiling, missing a front tooth. They were strangers. They were also, I understood, my half-siblings. The letters were not romantic. Marion was not in love with my father, and he was not in love with her. The letters were the correspondence of two people who had done a difficult thing together and who needed occasionally to confirm that the other person was still real. She asked about me sometimes, not often. She would write things like, "I hope he is well," or "I hope he is doing well in school," or in one letter from 2007, "I saw a young man in the grocery store today who reminded me of what I imagine he looks like now. I had to leave my cart in the aisle and go sit in my car for an hour. I am sorry to write this. I won't write it again." My father had kept every letter. He had not, as far as I could tell, written back. There were no copies of replies in the box, and Marion's letters made clear, over and over, that she had asked him not to. She had been very firm about that. She had said, more than once, that her sanity depended on it. The last letter was the shortest. It was dated November 4th, 2018. It said only, "Walter, I have been sick for a while now. The doctors are not optimistic. I wanted you to know. I am not asking for anything. I have made my peace with most of it. Please do not tell him. He has a life. Let him have it. Thank you for everything. M." I sat in the attic with the letter in my hand and listened to the house creak around me, and I understood finally why my father had kept the tape, not as a confession, not as evidence, as a record. As the only thing he had of the day, she had handed me over and asked him to drive away. I did not sleep that night either. The next morning I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. I had a decision to make, not a large one, a small one. I had to decide what to do with the information. There were really only three options. I could pretend I had not found any of it, put everything back in the cabinet and the attic, and finish emptying the house and go back to my life. I could try to find Marion, or her children, my half-siblings, and introduce myself. Or I could find some middle path, some quiet acknowledgement, some way of carrying it without dropping it on anyone else. I want to tell you that I chose the right thing. I'm not sure there was a right thing. I drove out to a small town in western Pennsylvania that afternoon. The return address on the most recent letters had been a place I had never been to. It was about 3 hours from my father's house. I drove with the box of letters in the passenger seat and the tape on the floor under it, and the radio off the whole way. I stopped once for gas. The cashier asked me if I was all right, and I realized I must have looked strange. I told her I was fine. I bought a bottle of water and got back in the truck. The address turned out to be a small ranch house on a quiet street, white siding, a flag in the front yard, a wind chime on the porch. There was a car in the driveway, a newer sedan, dark blue. I parked across the street and sat in my truck and looked at the house for a long time. I did not get out. I sat there for maybe 40 minutes. A woman came out of the house at one point, in her 50s or 60s, with brown hair going gray. She was carrying a small bag of trash. She walked it down to the can at the end of the driveway and walked back. She did not look at my truck. She went back inside. I could not tell from across the street whether she was Marion. The woman in the tape would be in her mid-50s now. The woman I saw could have been her, or she could have been someone else entirely, a neighbor, a friend, the new owner of a house Marion had moved out of years ago. I did not get out of the truck. I sat there until it started to get dark. Then I drove home. I want to explain why I didn't knock. I have thought about it a lot in the months since, and I think it comes down to this. The letters had been very clear. Marion had said, more than once, that she did not want me to know. She had said her sanity depended on it. She had said it as recently as 2018. If she was still alive, and if that woman was her, then knocking on her door would have been an act of taking, not giving. I would have been showing up at the house of a sick old woman to demand acknowledgement of a thing she had spent her life trying to make peace with. I did not have the right. I did not feel that I had the right. And if the woman I saw was not Marion, if Marion had died and that was someone else, then I would have been knocking on a stranger's door and saying something I could not take back. I drove home and I put the letters in the box and the box in the closet of my apartment, and I did not look at them again for a long time. I went back to work on Monday. I dispatched freight. I told the drivers where to go. I ate lunch at my desk. I went home in the evenings and made simple meals and watched television and tried to be a person who had not just learned what I had learned. It was harder than I expected, not because I felt different, because I didn't. I felt exactly the same. I looked in the mirror every morning and saw the same face. I went to work and was the same person at work. I called my Aunt Linda one Sunday a few weeks later because I had been thinking about it for a while, and I asked her, in the most careful way I could, whether there was anything my father had ever wanted to tell me. She paused on the other end of the line. She was 81 years old. She was the only person left who would have known. She paused for a long time, and then she said, "Adam, your father was a good man. He was a very good man. Whatever you found, you should remember that." And then she changed the subject, and we talked about her grandchildren for 20 minutes, and we hung up. We have not discussed it since. That was the only conversation I have ever had with another person about any of this. There are things I still don't know. I don't know how my father met Marion. I don't know whether my mother knew about her, or knew her, or had ever met her. I don't know who held the camera in the hospital room. I don't know who was in the second car in the driveway, filming my father drive away with me. I don't know what was said in the kitchen, off camera, when my father turned and spoke to someone. I don't know whether my half-siblings know I exist. I don't know whether Marion is still alive. I have not gone back to check. I have thought about destroying the tape. I have thought about it many times. There is something obscene about the existence of that tape. The fact that my father filmed it, or asked someone to film it, suggests that he understood the gravity of what was happening, that he wanted to remember it. But the fact that he kept it locked in a cabinet for 33 years and never showed it to me suggests something else. It suggests that he could not bring himself to tell me and could not bring himself to forget. It suggests a man living his whole life with one foot in a room he could not leave. I am told now that this is a common thing. People keep secrets like rooms. They go in and out of them. They keep the doors locked. They die eventually with the keys still in their pockets. I have not destroyed the tape. It is in a small fireproof box in my closet. I do not watch it. I do not need to. I remember every frame. What I have done instead is something small, something I did not plan and could not have predicted before all this happened. I have started, in the evenings, to fix things, small electrical things, a lamp from a thrift store with a broken switch, a radio I found at a yard sale, a toaster a neighbor mentioned was sparking when she plugged it in. I bought a small set of tools and a multimeter, and I taught myself, slowly, from videos on the internet. I am not good at it yet. I am better than I was. I sit at my kitchen table at night with a lamp opened up in front of me, and the components spread out on a towel, and I work on it for hours, and I do not think about anything else while I am working. My father did the same thing for 40 years, in the basement of the house I grew up in, with the radio playing the AM news. I do not know if he did it for the same reasons I am doing it now. I would like to think he did. I would like to think he sat down there with his hands busy and a small light over his shoulder and let the part of himself that could not be put right work on something that could. He was a good man, my aunt said. I want to believe her. I want to believe she would have told me if he wasn't. But I also know that the line between a good man and a man who has done a hard thing carefully is thinner than people admit. He took a child from a woman who could not raise him. He raised that child. He kept the woman's letters in a box in the attic. He kept the tape in a cabinet in the basement. He never told anyone. He died alone in a kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, and somewhere across the country, possibly, a woman in her 50s, who used to be 22, received the news through some quiet channel and sat down at her own kitchen table and absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything else for 33 years. Or perhaps she had died first, and he had known, and that was why he locked the cabinet one last time and went upstairs to put on the coffee. I am 34 years old. I am a freight dispatcher in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I have my father's hands, which I always thought I had gotten from him by blood, and which I now understand I got from him by something more deliberate than blood. He taught me how to hold a screwdriver. He taught me how to keep my voice level when I was angry. He taught me how to make coffee in the morning by smell. He taught me, without ever saying it, that there were rooms in a person you did not have to open, just because you knew they were there. I am not sure that is a good lesson. I am not sure it is a bad one either. I have started, recently, to think it is just a lesson, and that the value of it depends on what you do with it. I have not knocked on the door of that house in western Pennsylvania. I do not think I will. I have a half-sister and a half-brother somewhere in the world who do not know my name, and I am going to let them keep not knowing it. I have decided this. I decide it again every morning when I wake up. Some mornings it is harder than others. On those mornings I take out a lamp or a small appliance and I sit at the kitchen table and I work on it until my hands stop shaking. Then I make coffee. Then I go to work. The tape sits in the closet. The letters sit with the tape. The wooden box with the wedding band and the photograph sits with the letters. I have not opened any of them in almost a year now. I will not open them again, I think, unless something changes. Unless someone knocks on my door instead, and I have to decide what to say. If that ever happens, if a woman I have never met shows up one evening on my porch, or a young man with a face I half recognize, or a phone call from a number I do not know, I have thought about what I would do. I would invite them in. I would make them coffee. I would sit down at the kitchen table across from them, and before I said anything else, before I told them anything about who I was or what I had found, I would ask them one question. I would ask them what they already knew, because that, I think, is the only kind thing left to do. To meet a person where they are, to not hand them a room they did not ask to enter. My father, in the end, did not hand me that room. He locked the door and kept the key in his pocket and let me find it after he was gone, when there was no one left to ask and no harm I could do by knowing. I used to think that was cowardice. I have come to think it might have been the most careful kindness a man like him knew how to give. I miss him. That is the strangest part of all of this. I miss him more now than I did before I found the tape. I think about him every day. I think about him sitting at his workbench with a lamp opened up in front of him and the radio on, and I wonder what he was thinking about. I wonder if he was thinking about her. I wonder if he was thinking about me. I wonder if he was thinking about nothing at all and just letting his hands do the work, the way I do now, the way I learned from him without ever knowing he was teaching me. I do not know what is on the other tapes in other cabinets in other houses. I only know what was on mine, and I know that I am still, in some quiet way, I cannot fully explain, his son. Not because of where I came from, because of where he kept me. That is the end of what I have to say about it. There is more, probably, that I will understand later. There always is. But for now, the cabinet is locked, and the key is in my pocket, and I am going to leave it there. If you've ever come home to clear out a parent's house, you know there are always more drawers than you remember, more boxes, more small locked things you've never thought about. Most of them are nothing. A few of them aren't. The next one I want to tell you about wasn't mine. It was a woman I met at a grief support group 6 months after my father died. She found something too. Hers was in a safety deposit box. And what she found there is the reason I started writing any of this down at all.